Lesson 61, Simplifying Radical Expressions. So if we have two square roots that are multiplied, so the square root of a times the square root of b, it's the same thing as if we take the square root of their product, a times b. So this is, for instance, if we had the square root of 3 times the square root of 5, we could just multiply 3 and 5 and get the square root of 15. And we can also separate the two. So if we have the square root of a product, we can take the square root of each of its factors. So here's an example. If we had the square root of 27, we can think of a perfect square, which is 9, and times it by the square root of 3. And we know that the square root of 9 is 3, so it's just equal to 3 times the square root of 3. So if we wanted to look at, say, the square root of 72, that is the square root of 9 times the square root of 8. We know the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 8 could be the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, so we have 3 times 2 times the square root of 2. Then we simplify. 3 times 2 is 6 square roots of 2. Now, when we have a square shape, so the shape of a square, the area is going to be the side length squared. So if we want to know the side, we could take the square root of the area. So here's an example. If we have a square and the area is 64 inches squared. Well, that area is equal to the side squared, so we can take the square root of 64 inches squared. Well, the square root of 64 is 8, and the square root of inches squared is inches. So one side would be 8 inches. Anytime we have the square root of a number squared, it equals that number. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 10,000, well, that is equal to the square root of 10 to the 4. And we could write that as 10 squared, square root of 10 squared times the square root of 10 squared. By this rule, the square root of x squared equals x, so we have the square root of 10 squared just equals 10. So we have 10 times 10, or 100. And what's really cool about powers of 10s, if you have an even number, the answer is just half the exponent, 10 raised to half of that exponent. So if we had the square root of 100,000, now this is not an even exponent, this is equal to the square root of 10 to the 5th. Now we can take out the evens, square root of 10 squared times square root of 10 squared times the square root of 10. That is equal to the square root of 5. So, 10 to the 5th. So the square root of 10 squared is just 10, square root of 10 squared is 10, 10 times 10, 100 root 10. So if you have an odd number, you take half of one less, so you take half of 4, which is 10 squared, and that's 100, and then you leave one of the 10s on the inside. It's kind of cool. So if you have the square root of 20,000, you can think of that as a square root of 2 times the square root of 10,000. Up above, we figured out the square root of 10,000 is 100, so we have 100 times square root of 2. Now if we're looking at square root of 81, x to the 4th, y cubed, we can take the square root of 81 times the square root of x to the 4th times the square root of y squared times the square root of y. So the square root of 81 is 9. Square root of x to the 4th is half of 4, so it's x squared. Square root of y squared is just y, and then we still have the square root of y there. And that's the end of the lesson.